Good day to you all, and thank you for taking the time out to join our webinar. We do appreciate just how busy everyone is right now. And I guess that's why we saw this initiative as so important. We can see so many of our clients are struggling a little right now, working harder and harder just to stand still, balancing the pressures of work and perhaps also having to juggle other pressures at home, such as remote schooling. The healthcare industry is really important to us, and so we wanted to give something back to a sector that has supported us so well for over 16 years in actual fact. And in this session, we'll explore how you can find ways to look after yourself and your strategy. We will first hear from Jodie Hill, an employment and HR law specialist, a mental wellbeing champion who is regularly called upon by the UK media to provide commentary on HR and wellbeing issues. We will then hear from Cate Russell. Cate has spent much of her career in healthcare, both on the front line as a healthcare practitioner, as well as in corporate strategic roles in large pharma. And she's currently working as a consultant for the UK National Health Service. Finally, we'll hear from Chris Hall, who for many of you will need no introduction, as one of the thought leaders in medical devices and drug delivery for over 30 years now. I would say that this is your session, and so please do feel free to post any questions or comments. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of each presentation and at the end of the session. And I sincerely hope you find it both insightful and helpful. Jodie, if I will, I'll pass over to you. I think you're on mute, Jodie, sorry.
Awesome, thank you. Can you move to the next slide, please? Perfect. So for me, it's really, really important that, especially as a leader, that we look after our own well-being first. And actually, whilst on the agenda it says about looking after, ourselves, one of the things I'm going to talk about today is how, first of all, we do that for ourselves, but actually how we do that for our teams as well. Because ultimately, when we come out of lockdown and kind of moving forward and out of what's been a really difficult time for so many people, we will need to have a resilient team to do that in order to thrive once we get back to whatever the new normal looks like. So I think it's fair to say, I was talking to the guys before about the impact of lockdown. I mean, obviously in the UK, we're in our third lockdown. Everybody's had lockdowns at different times, and those have been incredibly difficult, especially through the winter months, particularly because, I mean, for me, I have anxiety, and I think, the uncertainty of when things are ending, the longer nights, the fact that you can't see people, all of those things have a cumulative effect over a period of time. And ultimately, I don't even think I need to talk much about the impact of lockdown. I think everybody's felt it in some way or another. So I think it is something that we need to consider, not just for ourselves and in our personal lives, but also in the workplace. Here in the UK, we're working from home. It's mandatory to do that at the moment. And obviously that brings up its own challenges as well. It's not the normal way of working from home. It's, very isolated, and often you're not seeing or speaking to anyone other than through a screen. So that can in itself have an adverse impact. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge how that will impact our teams moving forward, and actually try to look at some of the areas in our own workplaces and how we can improve those so that people aren't feeling left out, lost, or just generally isolated, especially those individuals who live and work alone. So I'm going to talk about 3 key areas. So I'll take you to the next slide. So the first one is communication, and I always say it sounds really basic, but so many people get the communication piece wrong. When it comes to well-being, in my view, communication is at the core. It's not just sending emails and telephone calls and video calls. I don't just mean that the kind of the method. For me, it's about understanding how people want to be communicated with right now, because we're all in this storm together, but we're all in different boats. So it's trying to understand, what people need, how they need it, when they need it, and just a blanket approach to communication or to well-being or to any of the policies that you're putting in place through this difficult time can actually have a detrimental effect on your team. So I'll give some examples. So one of the ways that we dealt with the communication issues when we went into the first lockdown was we just evaluated everything that we were doing. We actually spoke to every single staff member to ask them what they needed, how they'd want to communicate. Some people, it's actually really interesting, some people wanted to speak to me every day, but other people were happy to just have a WhatsApp message. Other people wanted to be on a video call. Other people wanted to be on the phone. We also collectively decided that we wanted an informal WhatsApp group. Some of our clients use things like Slack. There's lots of different messaging platforms that you can use. But ultimately, having that informal chat as well as the formal communication in the workplace really helped people still feel connected. And part of the communication piece as well is, we are socially distanced, but we don't have to be, we don't have to not speak or communicate just because we're not physically together. And so if you can improve the communication and make sure that's effective, both internally and externally to your clients, to your staff, to your friends, to your family, it's really about understanding what people need. And I suppose the other side of it is making sure that people don't feel that you're just checking up on them, that you don't trust them to be at home, giving people that trust, but also telling them that you're there if they need them. Not only will that help them in terms of their own mental well-being and their resilience, but it will also help you, because you won't be having to think as managers or as business owners, well, how do I support this person, or am I messaging them too much? Have that open and honest communication. Think about how you communicate, and actually, when you've got some valid data like we did from our research that we did with our team, actually use that and tell the team how you've used it, so that they feel heard and actually they feel part of what this new normal and this transition is and will be. So I do talk about communication a lot, but I do think whilst it is really basic, it's something that everybody can improve on. The other piece of communication that we've encouraged is around talking about how we feel. So because we don't see our physical signs of, if you're sat in the office and someone's being really quiet or they've got their head in their hands, or that's obviously a stereotypical, but if someone's not feeling quite right. And it's very difficult to communicate that if you're on your own at home. So we have downloaded a free app called the Form Score, and basically everybody joins a group and everybody puts in their form. So you score yourself from 1 to 10 every day, and you can say in the app what it is that's caused you to be a 7 out of 10 or a 9 or a 2. And so what you can do is you can actually check in on each other in a less formal way, and the app prompts you every day. It's a free app that you can download on the App Store, but we just found that was a really nice way to normalize conversations around how we feel. It's especially a British thing where we go, oh, are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. And I think that is just automatically a response that we say, and actually we're not always fine. So just normalizing that can really help, because what it can allow people to do is really open up if they are feeling under pressure or in any way stressed or overwhelmed, rather than bottling it up and it getting worse and them actually becoming mentally unwell. So that communication has really helped us to just normalize that conversation. And then the other type of communication that we have encouraged is actually through individuals having peer-to-peer support. So rather than, like if you were in the office, you would go to the coffee place, I don't know, the cafeteria or whatever, and you would have a chat with someone and you'd probably just talk about the weather or what you did at the weekend. We don't really have that while we're working from home and in lockdown. So what I've encouraged my staff to do is to actually make time every day to speak to someone different, and for it not to be about work. And again, that just helps people to first of all feel still connected socially, even though we can't be physically connected, and it really helps them to open up and communicate in a more effective way. And then the final thing I'd say on communication is something that we've recently rolled out. Is it's a little bit like a roadmap of how we communicate and how we prefer to communicate. So, for example, I will fill it in and say, I like my information in short, concise formats. I like things to be, so you basically explain how you like to communicate. Everybody creates their own document and then sends it to each other, so that everybody's clear about the best way, that because obviously we all learn and retain information differently. So having that open and honest approach, especially if you're onboarding people remotely, it can be really strange for people to join a company and not know anything about anyone apart from seeing them on a screen. So there are lots of different ways, as you can see, to improve communication, but there's just a couple of ideas of things that we've done. And actually what we've found is it's really improved the well-being of our team. So next slide, please. So we know it's improved the well-being of our team because we carried out risk assessments to establish that. Now, the risk assessments we actually do, we use a company to do it because I'm quite a small organisation. I don't have the capacity to do it myself. But essentially what the purpose of the assessment is to, it's twofold. One is to assess whether or not there's a need in the workplace in terms of training, or anyone's at a crisis point, anyone needs reasonable adjustments. So any support from a well-being perspective. And that's not just mental health, it's physical health, musculoskeletal, it looks at nutrition, sleep, everything, because all of that affects our resilience, all of that affects our well-being, and all of that affects our mental health. So the idea behind the risk assessments is really to identify some of those key areas that the business needs to work on. So from a business perspective, it's about targeting your resources and making sure you're investing in the right areas and supporting people in the right way. And it actually helps your communication piece as well, because you're actually asking people, what do they need? The other benefit to the risk assessments we use is that every individual completes this anonymously. So what we find is that there's a really high engagement rate, and people tend to be more honest about their personal circumstances, or if something is causing them stress, they can attribute it in this assessment. And off the back of that, the individual gets a self-care report. So they get 3 areas or a percentage that they need to work on, and some step-by-step guides in terms of how they can improve that. So every single person gets a bespoke report created through this piece of tech. So it's really helpful, because again, it goes on from the communication and actually really targeting on how you can support people. But crucially, one of the things that's actually I think is really innovative of this whole process is it's actually identifying if people are at risk. So if someone, when they're filling in the form, it's created by doctors and psychiatrists and loads of other therapists and researchers, but essentially it marks people like they would if they were having an assessment with a doctor, so they can assess if someone's at risk, and then it signposts them to let them know what the support would be. So what we found is actually it's really, really positive from a suicide prevention perspective as well. So the risk assessments for me are a huge thing. I'm actually campaigning for them to be mandatory in the UK, and I'm asking the government to support with that and actually provide a template or some support in terms of funding for businesses, because I think this could revolutionise the way that we talk about mental health, physical health and well-being in the workplace. And actually, rather than putting things on like a yoga class or free fruit, we don't know if people don't do enough yoga or eat enough fruit. So why do we do that? Why don't we target what the staff actually need? And by doing that, not only do people feel heard and actually valued, what they also feel is what you actually see is when you redo the risk assessments, you can see an increase in their resilience and a decrease in their stress. So it's really data driven, and I really like that. Being a lawyer, I do like the data, but actually from a business perspective, you want to see that what you're investing in your people is actually working. So that's on risk assessments. Next slide, please. And then the final thing for me is embedding all of that with some training. I think, there's one thing identifying all of those areas, it's then putting in place the right support. So do your managers know how to have difficult conversations around mental health, around suicide, around well-being? Do they know how to approach those situations in a sensitive and actively listen, rather than simply assuming what somebody needs? And actually part of that risk assessment helps you identify those areas. So what I've found is by using that process and working on the communication first, then identifying the risks and areas of improvement, then embedding it with training, and then going back through that cycle. That for me has worked incredibly well, both internally and with our clients. There's lots of different types of training, and I think for me, it shouldn't just be focused on well-being. There should be stuff all around your D&I initiatives and actually really supporting people holistically rather than on in a tick box way. So we developed our own training platform called Thrive Wellbeing. Actually just did it for my staff in the first lockdown, but it's been really well received by our staff, and we've rolled it out to our clients. But essentially, that's training that people can access on any device, so they don't have to join a Zoom call, they don't have to do it all at the same time. You can access it at your own pace, your own time, and obviously in your own home. So have a look for things like that are really accessible and that aren't really time consuming, but you can do more frequently. Try to embed things into the culture rather than approach it from a tick box perspective. How am I doing for time? Right, last slide, promise. Next slide, please. And finally, this is for everybody, is really encourage and practice what you preach when it comes to self-care. I'm a huge advocate for self-care, mainly because I had a mental breakdown 3 years ago before I set my firm up. And so I embedded this into my culture because I felt it was so important in order for us to survive. What I've now done is grown my firm from just me to 15 people in the space of 3 years. And actually, that's been everything that we've done has had diversity, inclusion, and mental health in the workplace at the core of everything we do. So it's been really intrinsically linked to everything. And actually, the staff also get involved with these things. So what I've done through lockdown is I've run little initiatives. So this month we had a steps challenge, and every day everybody had to send from their watch or their phone the number of steps they've done. So I was encouraging people to get outside. I was encouraging them to do walking meetings and making a bit of a competition around it. The month before, we had a power hour initiative. So every day someone had to take a full hour just for them to do something they really love that makes them feel good. All of these little initiatives don't cost anything, you know, they're just something that I just tried to do to make it a bit more fun. But essentially what I'm doing is promoting self-care. You know, there's loads of images on here of different ways that I practice self-care, but things like you know, exercise for me is a huge piece of my self-care. So make time for that for yourself, but encourage that in your team. You know, reading for some people is not self-care, they couldn't think of anything worse, but reading for someone else is their time for their brain to chill. So work out what works for you, work out what works for your team, and really try to embed this into the culture. And actually what you'll find is you create a sense of community that perhaps you didn't have before. And so it is possible to do this, and it's not too late if you haven't already. But if anyone's got any questions about different initiatives or any of the things that I've talked about, happy to answer some questions. I think I'm just about on time.
Perfect, thank you, Jodie. We've got a couple of questions actually for you, and an observation from me. I think we all had a little smile when we met earlier in the week about a lawyer who's also a people person, and that doesn't happen very often. They do exist. So we have a question from Christian. How have you found engagement from the staff and the willingness to be completely honest within the app?
Is this about the form app or the risk assessment? But either. I suppose I can answer for both. In terms of the form app where you're saying what your form is, everybody's downloaded it, and we have a little group and we chat about the engagements, but everybody's done it. So I mean, we have a really small team, so it might be slightly more difficult, I think, if you've got, you know, hundreds of people. But essentially, if people aren't engaging in it, it's reaching out to them to ask why, and try to understand what the reason is. If they say, oh, I'm too busy, no one's too busy to write I'm a 7 out of 10, you know what I mean? So it's really about understanding why they're not making time to do that. And it might be because they're not okay. And then actually that opens that conversation around what support they need. In terms of the risk assessments, they are about, in my experience, around 95% of people complete them. There's about that's in terms of our clients and us. When I've spoken to the company, they said there's an average between 60 and 75% of engagement in terms of those as well. So it's not as high as doing the form, but you get a lot more data out of it, and obviously it's really beneficial from an investment perspective.
Yeah, and we've done that with all of our guys, and I think the important thing is acting upon that information, right? So yeah. When they do complete them and they need eye tests or they need new chairs, then we actually ensure that gets delivered upon to keep it credible. So a question from Joelle over in France. What could we do immediately in our companies if we detect that somebody among our colleagues is feeling bad because of COVID? Apart from dropping a word into human resources, what can we do? What can we do ourselves?
I think you can reach out personally. I think, what we've learned from these lockdowns and from these ongoing restrictions is that we are a little bit more relaxed in terms of that communication, like having dogs and Zoom calls and, children coming in, that type of thing. So I think if it was me and it's to someone in my team, I just reach out to them directly. I call them and I ask them. And I always ask more than once. I think there's an automatic response when we ask somebody, how are you? Or are you all right? They'll go, yeah, I'm fine. So ask things in a different way and try to be there in a supportive way, but obviously not too intrusive. So it's a really fine line. And this is, again, where the training is really helpful, because if people don't have that skill set to have those more difficult conversations, then often what we find is it can make it worse. So really approach it in a very sensitive way if you think that someone is struggling. And again, the team stuff is really helpful, because getting them involved in something as a team doesn't isolate them and say, oh, are you okay? It's actually bringing together that community. One of the things I did was I actually sent cards out to all my staff, like saying I was really grateful for their support in lockdown, and I'd keep sending them bits in the post, and just little things like that actually they cost almost nothing, but they mean so much. And the feedback from that was, I was having a really bad day and you turned it around for me because you sent me the nicest words and I've not had a card in years, kind of thing. Yeah. So there's loads of little things that you can do. It's just think outside the box and maybe think more personal than corporate.
Yeah, no, great point. Thank you. A question from me, actually. I certainly in the marketing industry, there's been a lot of discussion over the course of the last few months about diversity and inclusion. You touched on D&I earlier, and I guess there's a sort of a wave now that D&I should be formally embedded in company policy. Do you see there coming a time when mental health will be a formal policy discussion?
I do. I think it's certainly going up the agenda, because I wrote a white paper on it recently about the impact of COVID on mental health, and it's really clear that there's a huge decline, especially because there's no access to services and that and the lack of social interaction. So we know there's a problem, and there was a problem pre-COVID, but it's certainly moving up the agenda, because I think because of the severity of the problem, people are talking about it more. Things have changed. The conversation is being more normalized in organizations, and actually by doing that, what we find is organizations then tend to implement more initiatives and more conversations. And, all my clients have policies around mental health and wellbeing, stress, flexible working, and it's something we encourage from day one. So for me, yes, I do think there is a shift. I think one of the impacts of lockdown has been around the lack of support for D&I, because it's kind of dropped off, because diversity and inclusion is not seen as essential. It's kind of crisis management and getting through this really difficult time. But I certainly think mental health has gone up in the agenda.
Thank you. There is one more question, but I'm going to leave that to the end, because I'll be really interested to get both Cate and Chris's perspective on that as well, if I may. Jodie, thank you very much. And I have to say, I've known Jodie from afar for a while now, and she's an extremely brave lady going through what she's gone through with her own struggles, and come out the other side with a successful business, and all credit to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Cate, let's talk about EQ and type 2 thinking.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, following on from Jodie's presentation, I'm getting a little bit more on what is happening to your brain and what's going on in your head, but more from a business perspective than from an individual personal side of things. So I call this about strategy under fire. So if we have a look at, I'm just going to, are you moving the slides there, Paul, or shall I use my share screen? Because I have made a couple of tweaks.
Charlotte's going to drive for you.
Oh, right. Okay, then. Thank you very much. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to share with you today is I've been fascinated by motivation and understanding how people think, because when you're in sales and marketing, you're trying to get into people's heads. So this is going to talk about some of the facts and figures and concepts that over the last 35 years of being in the pharmaceutical industry and the health industry I have come across, and more to the point, how to maximize and make benefit from understanding some of this. So on average, we make 35,000 decisions a day. To make that manageable, 95% of our time is spent on autopilot. And this is where you are in fast type 1 thinking. And the thing that makes fast type 1 thinking interesting is this is where your biases lives. This is where you will default to certain behaviors. And if you are not really conscious of what your default mode is, it can have a huge impact on long-term business approach and the way that you're interacting with your clients and customers. There's 5% of your time is actually in type 2 thinking. And this is a much slower, conscious effort of thinking. And the advantage of it is that it's structured. And it will actually allow you to have enough time to really structure and test some of the assumptions that you've got. So when you have a look at the bottom there, you can see the references to some of these quotes that you've got on the screen there. But the key thing to take forward is the idea of type 1 thinking, default bias. Type 2 thinking, finding a structure and testing assumptions. So when we move on, the next slide there, we're going to just have a look at what's going on in fast thinking. So Jodie, if we just start, sorry, Chloe, that's it, great, okay. So type 1 thinking is fast thinking. So if you just keep clicking through and we will then see what happens. So positive thinking of type 1 is that it's quick. It keeps you sane. It allows you to be busy because there's lots of things going on your mind at the same time. It gets the job done. And it's the kind of thinking that happens if you are in a crisis, you will behave and follow instruction or give instruction that could even save lives. The limitations of this is that it's very knee-jerk and it's prone to what I'm talking about, the unconscious biases. And it actually means that you have limited horizons because you often just keep repeating the same patterns to your thinking and behavior. And because of this, there is a real risk of functional fixedness, which in long term for an organization and a business could lead to obsolescence. You're just doing the same thing over and over again because it's a quick, fast, easy thought process. So slow thinking, type 2 thinking, if you click into those for me there we go. The advantage of type 2 thinking is this is where the business growth and new ideas will come forward. And it's about looking at how do you future-proof your business and how do you reduce the risks that you're taking because you're more contemplative of the impact. There's more consequential thinking being done. The limitations of this is it does take longer and it's not intuitive. And often in a very positive culture, and it can be in very fast-moving businesses, you could be accused of navel gazing. People like people to short sentence, quick answer, get it done, move on. But actually, the navel gazing bit is where you're sitting and really looking forward into the future on things. So if we move to the next slide. Learning to harness both types of thinking is when you can really start getting into what's potentially there for you in your brain. So I got quite interested in motivation and really understanding how people think. And I came across a tool, this is quite some time ago, and it's a 6 seconds, it's a psychometric tool, but it's actually based around emotional intelligence. And it starts to really unlock thinking. And if you move on to that slide, excellent, thank you very much. It talks about understand your own bias. And then when you go to meet the needs of your client, you can get into what is their bias. So when we look at this, you can see on here that the brain has 3 focus areas. You've got rational and emotional, what gets your attention first. Then there's the decision making, are you evaluative or innovative? And then finally, there's the drive area, whether or not you are someone who's motivated, are you driven and motivated by practical short-term delivery, or are you future motivated and are more interested in vision? So when this comes out into looking at the types of behaviors that are going on underneath, and this is where your biases sit. So if you look at where these arrows are here on this particular profile of this random person, one of the things that's interesting is if I am somebody who sits with an emotional focused bias, I like to connect with people and collaborate and to talk and to really start to get to know the person before I would get into data mining and modeling and prioritizing. And by the way, this isn't my profile, this is a profile. So when this is a person who sits over this side and you're trying to understand a campaign or work with somebody, if you sit here in a data mining and prioritizing bias, there is a risk of miscommunication and not being in the same pace as somebody who's more on connection and collaboration. When it comes to decision making, if you're sitting here and this person has got risk tolerance and critical thinking as their 2 features, this is another area where you, by understanding your own bias, you can start ensuring that when you're planning a strategy and you're thinking about the client's campaign, you can get into what's important to them. What are the priorities for them and how should you be talking to them? And then finally, you can get into and what will close the deal? What will close the thinking for this person? Is it going to be visioning with them and looking ahead and motivating them by the future thing? Or are they the sort of person who needs to get down to the practicalities as quickly as possible? So type 2 thinking is to be aware of your own biases and to think in terms of, if I am under pressure, and this is what we're talking about the pressures business is under at the moment. If you're under pressure, is there a risk that you are reverting to your own traits and not as sensitively tuned into the traits and the needs and the biases of your customers? So I'm going to move on to the next slide now, because the thing about slow thinking, type 2 thinking in business, is it really helps to have a structure. It really helps to have a way of thinking. This is what type 2 thinking likes. Now, personally, and as Jodie says, I like things very sort of organized and in very visual, straightforward, simple ways of thinking. And this slide might not look that straightforward, but the 3 horizons strategy I like, because the very first thing it asks you to do is look to the future and stand in your customer's shoes. And this is where emotional intelligence as a way of thinking and working can be a very effective sales and marketing tool, because it allows you to enter into the future vision for your customer. And it also demands of you to think, if that's where we're going to be in the future, there are certain things that I'm going to have to bring back into the now. I'm going to have to start doing certain things because it may take a few years before we are at this position here. And this slow type 2 thinking is something that can be done, and it doesn't need to be sitting for days and analyzing everything. It is, where am I now? Where am I wanting to be? And what do I need to bring down into my now? And this is this piece of taking the time and pacing the different types of thinking that you need to do. So if we move on to the next slide, in summary then, if you click through these and put these up for me, there we go. You could be thinking that you've got enough to do just to get through the day with all of what's going on. But actually, crisis and stress do have benefits. It brings about first principle thinking, and that challenges current practices. Generally speaking, human beings don't like change. So the one thing that COVID has brought about is huge change for everybody. So there is an opportunity and a window where there is no norm at the moment. So there is a very good chance that people's minds are more open than they've ever been to thinking in terms of how do we look at the future and see things differently? How do we stop thinking in the terms that we've always thought of? So I would suggest using the energy of unpredictable circumstances when you're building your strategy would potentially bring you completely unexplored opportunities to look at. So we have some way to go, so pacing is important. But if you're exercising optimism, see yourself at the start line and start preparing to think about something completely different. Strike a balance between here and now and the future. And remember the EQ power, emotional intelligence power of the word yet. Because one of the things that we add, if we put it at the end, is I haven't done a plan yet. We haven't done it like that before, but there's no reason why we can't. We just haven't done it yet. And I challenge you to put the word yet at the end of statements and see how it changes your mindset. So we go to the final slide then. Intelligence will actually get you the job, but emotional intelligence is what's behind people's motivation and their thinking. So it's the ability to use emotions effectively and get an outcome that is greater than where you were when all of this crisis started. But don't just stay in type 1 emergency reactive thinking. It might not seem like the time to step back and be rechecking your strategy, but the mind is open. People now have no norms, and therefore anything is potentially possible. So that was what I wanted to talk about, and I've got a few minutes if you want to ask any particular questions. Thank you.
Kate, thank you. That was, I find this fascinating. I find it extraordinary, and obviously we've spoken at length about this now, and the power of yet is absolute. I think everybody on the panel and in the participant group would agree that the bars aren't open yet would be a very powerful statement. Do please send in any questions. We have got one. Kate, following on from what Jodie said about communication, is there anything you'd add from your perspective to ensure team cohesion, especially in the digital world we find ourselves in, where perhaps those face-to-face conversations aren't quite so easy?
Yeah, I think the thing that is very apparent to me is that human beings, 75%, I love all these percentages and numbers, I do apologise for those that are not motivated that way, but 75% of our communication is non-verbal. So one of the problems that we have got using all of this electronic stuff is that we actually have hugely restricted sensory input for us to be able to judge each other's, where are their moods, how are they feeling. You can tell how someone feels just by standing close to them normally, and we're trying to do that down a lens. It's sort of it's a completely different experience. So I think the how to ensure team brand cohesion things, it's really thinking about being choiceful in your words. And as Jodie said, it is ask more than once how someone is, and use words like feel. It's using much more of the emotionally connected words and not being embarrassed about that. And there's also something that came out of work I was doing with the NHS teams is, for some people, being able to have, and this is the visually motivated people, being on Zoom is great because for some people it's the eye contact of some form, it helps. But there are others that would appreciate a conversation on the phone or sometimes a text, because you could say things there in a safe environment. So not everybody will want the same solution. So it is that bit of words are very, very important, choosing the right words and taking time before you get to the task, just to acknowledge we're in crazy times and give people that little bit of headspace to relax and accept before moving on into whatever it is that you're wanting to do with the business. Does that give you those sort of responses? Good words,
Absolutely.
choosing the right words. Yeah.
Absolutely. And certainly I think, yeah, with email, you read the lyrics, but you don't hear the music, right? So it's always important, I think, to establish that tone. Cate, thank you.
Very much so.
Thank you. And last but not least, we are dead on time. This is extraordinary for a marketing guy to be on time. Last but no means least, we have Chris Hall, who is going to kind of bring all of this together in the context of drug delivery, medical devices, and pharma marketing. Oh, we can't hear you, Chris.
Into a drug delivery marketing context. So I'll try and do that over the next 10 to 15 minutes. As you'll appreciate, that's a very large subject. So I've been in the pharmaceutical drug delivery business for about 30 years. I've had a range of general management, managing director, strategy, marketing, acquisitions, but really for the last 20 years I've had strategic and operational board accountability for marketing in these areas. So I have been through a lot of the challenges that you're facing from a business perspective, perhaps not in the COVID context, and obviously until recently, which has been exceptional for everybody. But I'd like to try and take some of my thoughts about what the major trends are and bring that experience to bear on what you're experiencing now. Okay, so context. Whether I like it or not, how my company and my customers feel about me impact how I feel about myself. If they are looking at me as a valuable resource, seeing me as pivotal to what's happening in their business and in their market, then that gives me a greater sense of self-worth. And on the other side of the coin, if things are not going well and if I'm not being perceived as adding value, then I don't feel so good about that. So what are the imperatives for you as an individual, or what could they be in your context to try and increase how you're perceived in your business? So obviously understanding the significant trends that are going on in your market and assessing their potential impact on your business is important, and being able to vocalize that and being able to propose strategies and execute strategies to maximize the positioning and the benefit of those trends to your company is a key part of what marketing, strategic and operational marketing, does. So once you've looked at those trends and you've analyzed those trends, you have to be able to execute and deliver. So and talk a little bit about what some of the roadblocks are in execution and delivery. So drug delivery device trends, number one, biggest trend right now, obviously is COVID. I would guess that it's not too bold a statement to say that the supply chain challenge around vaccination has pretty much that game has pretty much played out. The vaccines are being approved all the time. The manufacturers are organising themselves, and pretty much that will roll out now, and it'll become. Generally, I think the perspective is that it'll become a very regular rhythm of high volume vaccination every year to deal with the emerging variants. We'll see if that works out, but certainly I think there's the potential for this to become a significant business stream over time. But really, I think the opportunity to create new positions with your customer base in relation to the vaccine supply chain is probably getting to be a mature opportunity now. So really the priority right now, I think, in terms of anything related to COVID, is to secure the long-term engagement of the customers that reached out to you in an emergency. I think, when they really, really need you, they're very open to talk and everything's possible. So you really need to maximize your position right now to say, okay, how do we convert that commitment we showed in responding to you? How do we convert that into a longer term relationship, particularly for the new customers that you've got in your stable now that you perhaps didn't have 12 months ago? I'll talk a little bit more about creating relationships with new customers as opposed to existing customers a little bit later. But in the COVID environment, that's become extremely difficult. And in relation to COVID supply chains, it's probably one of the few areas where there is a real increase in new supplier customer relationships because there's had to be. The other thing I think really marketing needs to be doing at this point is ensuring that your company gets the recognition it deserves for the part that you played in really creating this massively accelerated vaccine approval program and being in a position to roll this out to the world. It's astonishing what has happened. If your company has played any part in that, even if it's just making sure that your existing pharmaceutical products are, even unrelated COVID products, are still in supply, still being manufactured, you need to get credit for that, because that's standing up when it counts. And the number one requirement for pharmaceutical companies in selecting a drug delivery partner, it's not quality, it's not cost, it really is security of supply. So being there when it matters, being there when it's difficult, that deserves credit. Marketing's job is to make sure that you get that. Now, obviously, there has been a very significant, about an 800% increase in telemedicine in the US. That's been driven by a lot of things. One is doctors don't want patients in their surgeries because they're infected. Patients don't want to come to doctors' surgeries because they're seen as centers of infection. So that's accelerated the adoption of telehealth and digital health solutions by about 5 years, is the estimate from the people that I'm speaking to. You may be in a position to take advantage of that and really crystallize your company's position in the transition to digital or distance patient monitoring. So I think that's a trend. A lot of companies, including ones I'm working with, have been investing in digital for quite a few years now, put quite a lot of money in there. Really, this could well be the catalyst that starts to see a return coming on some of those investments. Okay, I think there's another real major trend that's happened, and this has been a slow one over probably 10 years, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's specifically relevant to how you go about marketing in the drug delivery space. So when I first started out in drug delivery in the 90s, it was a very, very simple game. You had in each therapy area, you had probably 5 or 10 big pharma R&D teams that were bringing out the new chemical entities, and that was the engine, blockbuster new chemical entities. And if you were the drug delivery solution selected on that NCE development with a big pharma company, then you got the generics, you got the follow-on products, you got the market share. So really for marketing's job and sales and the relationship management with customers was all about being on that NCE development with big pharma, and the big pharma relationships were really important. They're still really important because they're a big part of the volume. But in terms of where big pharma is now getting their products from, they're now coming from much smaller biopharma companies. So 2018, 80% of the late stage clinical trials products that were out there were being developed by biopharma companies with a turnover of less than $500 million. So you've gone from a situation where you were marketing to a very relatively small population of very well characterized pharma companies to a situation where everything from a university department to two men and a molecule with some venture capital may be developing the next big product in your therapy area that will be in-licensed and marketed by big pharma. That's a big change. It's very hard now to put a sales guy in front of every opportunity. That's hard because of COVID, but it's hard because of the number of them as well, and also the failure rates are very, very high. So how do you prioritize what those need to be done? So transitioning your activities to as much relationship building and information sharing and confidence building online as possible is obviously a key trend and a key way to go. I don't think this is going to go in the other direction. I think big pharma is likely to keep in licensing the successful products. I think the innovation risk, the early stage innovation risk, is likely to continue to be carried by venture capital and that type of money rather than big pharma, or at least shared in that way. There are big commercial advantages to drug delivery companies in accessing these opportunities early and becoming engaged in those programs, but it's not really the subject for today. So how does your business adapt to this fragmentation of the customer base and the need to be able to interact with many, many more customers than before, perhaps 20 times as many customers? I think the other significant trend that seems to be going on out there at the moment is that device companies are merging or transitioning into integrated CDMO type businesses. There's a couple of examples of this. Recipharm's acquisition of Consult Medical and BestPac would be a good one. Vectura's strategy change from inhalation device product innovator to CDMO with device capabilities would be another. But I think understanding how this is happening in your space and how that impacts your positioning and your communications to your customers, I think that's a key element that you should be looking at right now. Okay, so what should we be focusing on right now? One of the key learnings for me over the years has been that in these highly technical drug delivery business, technical content is king. You know, technical content, it increases the customer's understanding of the value that your company brings to the table in pharmaceutical development. It drives your market credibility. And it lowers the perception of risk of the pharma company in dealing with your company. So technical content is king. My experience has been that this is incredibly frustrating for marketing because there are usually in an organization relatively few people who are capable of explaining and communicating the technical content. So in order to get technical content written, you really need to capture those people and get them to help you to make technical content. Now, right now you've got an advantage because your technical teams are not on planes with customers, they're not in project meetings, they're probably working from home. And they may be much more accessible now than they have been in the past. So I think my advice would be that in most organizations that I've worked with, and certainly it was true in the last 3 or 4, technical content has been the marketing bottleneck as to how much you can get out there, what sort of impact you can have in the market. You have an opportunity now to potentially generate a whole raft of technical content that you can put out over the next year, 18 months, that'll really make your life easier. If you got the content in your back pocket, then rolling that out, putting that out across the different streams is a key thing to do. The other thing that I was going to say here was that I think there is spend in your budget is being repurposed very, very quickly. So there's been really, really big changes. There's no big conferences, there's no travel, there's no entertainment. Those were big parts of the marketing budget in the past. Those have disappeared. So that money needs to be repurposed and spent on technical content, online presence, sponsorships, perhaps student sponsorships, even social media, building your virtual presence. The point I would make is that if you don't spend it, you're very, very likely to lose it, and it'd be very hard to get this back when things return more to normal. So really focus on repurposing your spend into areas where you're going to have long-term benefit of changing your online presence, for example. But also you're going to be delivering value from your budget right now in new ways. And the last point on this I would make is be brave. You really need to be, I think, the first mover as face-to-face business returns, probably later on this year. What are the conferences, what are the events that could happen in the third quarter of 2021? Being out there, being part of the driver that gets business rolling in that face-to-face environment again. I think there will be a lot of credit to be had for organizations that do that. And a lot of new relationships will be able to be built in that context. So planning and engaging in that now, and not sitting back and saying, well, we'll see what happens, it's impossible to plan. I think that's really important. Be a first mover and be brave. So just to wrap up, we are in pharmaceutical marketing, and I like this quote from Albert Camus. It says, "Where there is no hope, it's incumbent upon us to invent it." Thank you. I'll pause for questions.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate that. We do have a rather challenging question for you to answer. Given the trend that you mentioned around single source supply and integration, do you anticipate device companies becoming pharma companies in the long run?
I think that came from Joel, didn't it? And Joel is at least as qualified to answer this as I am, but I'll have a go. I think that device companies, one of the trends that I mentioned was the fact that the big pharma guys are not really developing most of the new products. It's being developed by much smaller companies. These smaller companies don't have the capabilities, the technical capabilities to support products all the way through the development pipeline. So basically, if you're providing a device, you also need to be able to provide many more services around that device, things that big pharma may well have done internally in the past. These smaller companies can't do internally, and they need to get it from somewhere else. So either they need to get it from you as a device company, or they need to get it from the infrastructure. And I think that's part of what's driving this this trend of integration of CDMOs and device companies. Will they end up as pharma companies in the end? I'm not sure. I think marketing pharmaceutical products to the healthcare system is a very specialist expertise and very, very different to marketing to big pharma or marketing to development companies. So I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. I've got a question for all three of you, if Cate and Jodie want to unmute and rejoin us. It was a question that was asked right at the beginning, but I want to leave it at the end because for me it feels like a really good summation of what we've tried to talk about today. Are there any sort of simple strategies? What's the one thought, I suppose, that you would like to leave everybody with about how we can ensure our own and our company's positive well-being as not only in COVID times but beyond? So if you were going to do one thing to change the game and ensure the well-being of yourself and your organisation going forward, what would it be? We'll start with you, Chris.
I think speaking to each of your people and communicating, as Jodie was talking about earlier, is the single most important thing. I've been unfortunate enough to have somebody in the organisation that I ran take their own life, and I really wouldn't want anybody else to go through that. And if you need to be doing everything you can possibly think of to communicate with people and minimize the risks of that and see it coming.
Thank you. Cate?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And sometimes it's just take a moment to pause and allow emotion to have a bit of space and actually examine what it is that you're trying to tell yourself. So to cut through the just being brave, just always cracking on, being busy, etc., just listen to that emotion, that feeling that you get. And if you get a feeling, pause and think, what message is it giving me? What am I actually sensing here? And then being there for other people. So reaching out, and if you haven't heard from somebody, just go and say hi. I mean, that's the thing, be human. This is about being incredibly human at this point in time, I think.
Thank you. Final word from you, Jodie.
Sure. I mean, I massively echo everything that you've said. I think that we need to put the human approach back into everything that we do. Obviously, we haven't seen each other, or not us guys, but we haven't physically seen a lot of people for a long time. So that human approach is going to be so important as we move forward. But for me, I do think that it's, if you want to if you want to lead by example, then you need to practice what you preach. And I think as leaders, we need to be open, honest, vulnerable, and we need to practice self-care and encourage our teams to do that as well.
Super, thank you. So we're just about on time. A huge thank you to Jodie, Cate and Chris for their real effort in putting the content together for this webinar. Very much appreciate it. Also appreciate all of you folks for joining this afternoon. It's a strange one. You're all really busy, and I'm asking you to take an hour out to watch a webinar. So really appreciate all of the questions and participation. It will be this has been recorded, and so we'll be able to reshare it with you at a later date. Just leaves me to say have a wonderful weekend all, and please stay safe. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.